Hi, so I'm gonna go ahead and get started. As you know, we are reading The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoevsky. In our last conversation, we were really trying to wrestle with the underground man and Dostoevsky's sort of critique of society and the sort of the thoughtful or rational person and the quote unquote normal or the man of action. Um, I wanted to just take a minute and just talk as you read this story, specifically the section on the Grand Inquisitor. Okay. So, as you know, I grew up Catholic, right? I still am Catholic technically. And so, one of the things growing up Catholic, going to Catholic schools, going to Catholic seminary, um, wanting to and almost becoming a priest, is that you begin to think about the Augustine tradition. Now, we haven't really talked Augustine in class yet. I will. But we begin to think about the Augustine tradition and how do you find God's perfect love, right? And especially living in a society of just rough, right? Of evil and destruction and temptations and sin and all that kind of stuff. Um, but we see God as having perfect love, right? And so we want to be in solidarity. Well, we want to be in this state of perfect love with God and in union and solidarity with God, as well as the suffering and the pain that we experience, and while at the same time trying to come into fullness or cognizance of God's goodness, right? That is the challenge of the Christian tradition, and especially the one of the challenges growing up Catholic. But most people, quite frankly, can't reconcile those two. Most people can't do that, and so it is here that we're thinking about the Grand Inquisitor with Dostoevsky, right? And this sort of critique of Jesus's program of salvation, right? Where he says it's too tough, right? It's too tough for people to actually deal with trying to follow and be like Jesus. So the masses of people can't gain access to that. Only the acceptable few. Maybe it's the saints, right? Literally the saints of the Catholic tradition. Maybe it's the saints, the holy folk in the Pentecostal tradition. I don't know. But only the few can actually get to this sort of fullness of God while accepting and reconciling the distinction between good and evil. And so maybe these few saintly types but for the rest of us and maybe the majority of us, it might be, according to Dostoevsky, is certainly inaccessible. We can't gain access to it. And I can imagine someone saying to Dostoevsky, I mean, look, dude, I mean, that's great for certain special people. It's great for the saints. But there are so many of us that aren't going to be able to attain that level of spirituality. So this really isn't a help for most of us, this wanting to be like Christ thing, right? Maybe at best, what we're trying to describe to the existentialist is a way out of the existential problem of evil, right? Because for a few saintly types, we're trying to escape the problem of evil. But for the rest of us, we ain't got no help. How do we respond? Well, I think Dostoevsky was pretty sensitive to that question. And I think the thing to say is that we certainly live in a deeply broken, messed up, futile world. And we're given a kind of gift, grace. I think the saints and people who try to be saintly, I think those individuals can really strengthen our hope. This is the beauty of the Catholic tradition. Because the saints can strengthen our hope, and the patron saints, the regular saints, can strengthen our hope that Christianity is real. The kind of transformation that the gospel promises to us is a real possibility to be made new, to be made whole, to get out of a certain context into the fullness. We experience a bit of it, hopefully in our own lives, but perhaps not as abundantly or profoundly as some might seem to have done. Y'all know the folk, blessed and highly favored folk. But life, this life anyway, is not where it all comes together for the existentialist. Well, maybe I should rephrase that. This life is not where it all comes together, and so we have to live in hope that in our redeemed life, we will ultimately come to the experience of that fullness. Now, that's the Christian tradition. That's the religious tradition. The Christian existentialists feel similar to that, but we'll get into that when we get into Kierkegaard. But for Dostoevsky, isn't it a mystery why some individuals are allowed to progress much further because they do so by the grace of God, and other individuals sort of struggle miserably and just barely hold on, like that, cling on to their faith and feel like they don't see a great deal of progress? They struggle. They wrestle against sort of settling into their sins and their character flaws, but they can't seem to shake it. In this part of the world in which God has placed us, set us, it's a broken world. And in a curious way, we must bear witness to this broken world. Witness to the truth of the gospel, the coming out, the newness. Behold, old things have passed away, all things are new. We stand in witness. And so the gospel then teaches us how deep the problem of sin really is. And some people are in the unfortunate role of manifesting just how messed up sin is and how broken the world can be. We just have to look at maybe some in politics, some in our day-to-day lives, grand level of hate, maldistribution of wealth, greed, poverty. The brokenness is real. The ugliness, how ugly it can look both intellectually, morally, and even via our experience phenomenologically. How ugly it can look. Rather effective, though. So we have to hope that in our redeemed lives, all of us will eventually come to share so that it's true. What's true? The gospel is true. Jesus becomes true. So then that way, in a way, the Grand Inquisitor in Dostoevsky's work is true that naturally speaking, given the range of the limited range of human possibilities and degrees of capacities to engage in sort of discipline that it takes to be like Jesus, the spiritual fortitude, to participate in God's process of transformation of ourselves in this sort of disciplined way. We know the story of Augustine. Augustine's mama was on his butt trying to get him to get disciplined. It took him so long to get there. But it wasn't until he found the discipline of being like Christ till he found happiness. But this God's process of transformation of ourselves in sort of a wholehearted way, well, yeah, we vary. But as human beings, we do vary in every dimension. And it includes our capacity to sort of undertake or to undergo this sort of strenuous self-reformation. But it's only by the grace of God. And that's just a fact that we have to recognize, and recognizing that some individuals, some folk are starting at a very different place, and they need to measure their progress by where they've come from, not how far along they've gotten. Think about that. We need to measure some folk how far they've come from, not how far they've gotten. We do it with our children. We don't expect our children to be adults. We expect our children to be better than they were 2-3 years before, right? Why shouldn't humans be any different? Adult humans be different. We've come from different social, political, economic, racial, gendered circumstances, and we have to deal with all the BS associated with it. Some of us have come this far by faith. Come this far in the face of racial injustice, in the face of gendered bias, in the face of violence. Can we measure them by how far they've come? That's the true transformation. So the thought here is that for me, growing up Catholic, the saints, right? The saints, they're giving us somewhat of a picture, sort of a program of what we can hope for in Christ in the long run. Maybe not in this life, but in the life to come, which is why Nietzsche and the rest of them were like, oh, whoa, what's going on, right? But the one thing to add is that these saints are telling us that, and that's why I always turn to Augustine, because I started off in a very bad place. Deeply angry, deeply self-centered, deeply flawed, lustful, aggressive. We all didn't start off as saints or saintly individuals, but by God's grace. Many of us we know, many of the saints literally within the church as well as those we call saints ended up in a very, very, very different place. So it holds out hope that it is possible, even for those who feel themselves to be the furthest away from the ideal of Christ, or the ideal of a Christ-like disposition that the gospel wants us to point to. I think that's the hope of the Grand Inquisitor. The literal point of view is be like, you ain't gonna get there, bro. Maybe religion is setting us up to fail. Dostoevsky is really putting it in our face. What is it that we're trying to accomplish? Is it an actual accomplishable goal? Or is this Christ story a setup? Because only a couple people, if that, can actually do what Christ has done, can actually live in the type of discipline that it takes to be Christ. All right. enjoy the read. I'm going to give a full lecture about an hour or so later on today or tomorrow with some board work and that kind of thing. So enjoy the read. Take care. Peace.